He was born in a small town in Italy, where the streets were quiet, the air smelled of baked bread, and the sound of church bells marked the passing hours. From a young age, he had felt a deep connection with music. It was not just a hobby for him. It was a calling. He would spend hours listening to the notes of the violin, studying the way the bow danced over the strings, feeling every vibration as if it spoke directly to his soul. By the time he was a teenager, it was clear that he had a gift, a rare talent that could touch hearts and fill rooms with emotion. His family noticed it first, then his teachers, and soon the community began to talk about the young boy who played with a maturity beyond his years. His early training was rigorous. Every day was a strict schedule of lessons, practice, and discipline. He learned to read music before he could read a book properly. His teacher, a stern man with a deep love for classical compositions, pushed him hard, telling him that music was not about fun, but about mastery and precision. The young violinist took these lessons seriously. He wanted to be perfect, and he believed that perfection meant only one thing: classical music. Everything else seemed casual, incomplete, or lacking the depth he was taught to value. Folk music, pop songs, even jazz felt like a step below, almost as if they did not deserve the same respect as the works of the great composers. By his early 20s, he had traveled to many cities in Europe. He performed in concert halls that echoed with history, each one a place where great musicians before him had poured their hearts into their music. He wore tailored suits and polished shoes, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his talent was rare. Critics praised his performances, calling them technically flawless, emotionally moving, and elegant. Audiences were captivated by the precision of his fingers, the clarity of his bowing, and the beauty of every note. He basked in this admiration. He believed that he understood music better than most people could, and he did not hide his opinions. When asked about different types of music, he would say with a smile, polite but firm, that classical music was the purest form of expression, while other styles were charming but simple, lacking the depth he valued. His pride in his own music was matched only by his skepticism of the music he did not know. He had read about mariachi music in books, seen pictures of musicians in colorful outfits, and heard recordings of lively tunes, but he dismissed them. He called it plain music, nothing more than cheerful noise with a few instruments and singing. He could not imagine it holding the same power or emotional depth as a violin solo by a master composer. It was a judgment he held without hesitation, and he felt secure in his knowledge. For him, music was a ladder, and mariachi was at the bottom rung. Despite his opinions, a new opportunity arose that promised to challenge his beliefs, though he did not yet realize it. He was invited to perform in Mexico City for a special European festival celebrating international music. The organizers wanted him to bring the elegance of European classical music to the audience, and he accepted immediately. He thought it would be easy. Another chance to showcase his talent to new admirers. He imagined the applause, the polite bows, and the recognition he would gain from performing abroad. He packed his violin carefully, making sure the case was secure, and set off on the journey with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through every concert hall in Europe. The flight was long, giving him plenty of time to think about his performance. He reviewed the pieces he would play, running through every note in his mind. He imagined himself on the stage, the lights soft, the audience attentive, waiting for each movement with bated breath. In his mind, the world of music was neat and orderly, composed of precise notes and deliberate emotion. There was no place in that vision for music that was free, loud, or informal. He wondered what the audience in Mexico would think of him, a foreign violinist playing music they might not fully understand. Still, he believed that great music needed no explanation. Its beauty was universal. His confidence was solid, unshaken, and he could not imagine that anything in Mexico would surprise him. When the plane landed, the city greeted him with a swirl of colors, sounds, and smells that were unfamiliar and exciting. Streets were lined with vendors selling food, children ran past carrying kites, and music floated through the air. At first he barely noticed it, focused as he was on the schedule for the festival. But as he walked from the airport to the hotel, he began to hear different rhythms, people singing and guitars strumming. The sounds were bright and lively, carrying joy and energy he did not immediately recognize. In his mind, he dismissed them as background noise, nothing serious, nothing worth his attention. They were cheerful, but they lacked the sophistication he valued. His first rehearsal in Mexico was in a large concert hall, designed to amplify every sound. As he played, he felt the familiar rush of confidence and control. The notes were clean, the movements practiced, and he could see that the hall responded to every delicate vibration of his violin. The organizers were pleased, the assistants impressed, and he felt at home. Yet outside the hall, the city thrummed with life. Street musicians played, singers performed in small squares, and the sounds of mariachi drifted into every corner. He heard snippets as he moved through the streets, and each time he shook his head, quietly muttering that it was nothing compared to real music. The violinist had built walls around his understanding, convinced that beauty only existed in the forms he knew. One afternoon, while exploring a market, he saw a group of musicians gathered around a small stage. They were dressed in traditional mariachi outfits, bright with embroidery and silver buttons. People had gathered, clapping along to the music. At first, he stopped to observe briefly, polite curiosity in his eyes. The music was fast, loud, and full of energy. The singer's voice rose above the instruments, strong and confident. Yet he found it hard to take seriously. He reminded himself that he was a professional musician, that he understood music at a depth these performers could never reach. He walked on, feeling both amused and superior, certain that nothing he encountered here could compare to the music he loved. That evening, back at the hotel, he thought about his schedule, his upcoming performances, and the brief glimpses of music he had heard during the day. Still, his mind returned to classical compositions, rehearsing the notes, feeling the familiar comfort of structure and control. He reminded himself why he had devoted his life to the violin, why he had spent countless hours practicing, and why other music, no matter how lively or popular, would never move him in the same way. It was a comforting thought, and it reinforced his belief in his superiority. Yet, even as he played his scales, there was a subtle curiosity, a faint tug at the edge of his awareness, as if the music he had dismissed might carry something he had yet to understand. As the days passed, he continued rehearsing, performing, and exploring the city, always keeping a polite distance from the local music that filled the streets. He attended briefings, met festival organizers, and prepared for his big performance with precision. Still, the sounds of mariachi seemed to follow him, impossible to ignore completely. They were everywhere, in the market, outside the hotel, in small cafes where people gathered to eat and sing. No matter how much he tried to dismiss it, the music had a presence that could not be ignored. He noticed the joy it brought to people, the way it connected them to their culture and each other. It was not the controlled, perfect sound of a concert hall, but it had life, emotion, and spirit. He had yet to admit it, but he was beginning to sense that there was more to this music than he had allowed himself to believe. On the morning of his first European-style performance in Mexico, he woke early, reviewing every note one last time. The hall was filled with an eager audience, the lights warm and welcoming. He took his place on the stage, violin in hand, and began to play. The music flowed, precise and beautiful, every note landing exactly as he intended. The audience listened, some with awe, others with polite appreciation. He felt the familiar thrill of performance, the sense that he was in control of every sound and every emotion. Yet, as he played, he could not completely shake the memory of the mariachi he had seen. Their voices and instruments vibrant and alive in the streets outside. There was a faint curiosity now, a tiny seed of wonder planted in his mind, though he refused to acknowledge it. In the back of his mind, he knew that soon he might encounter music that could challenge everything he believed about sound, skill, and expression. The next morning, the violinist woke to the sun spilling into his hotel room. Mexico City was alive, buzzing with colors, voices, and the constant rhythm of life. From his window, he could see people moving through the streets, selling fruits, bread, and handmade crafts. He could hear the faint strumming of guitars, a sound he had yet to take seriously, and the voices of singers singing songs that were new to him. At first, he tried to ignore it, convincing himself that his music, practiced and polished, was far superior. Yet the sounds kept floating through the air, insistent, persistent, and full of life. He decided to explore the city before his next rehearsal. He walked through narrow streets lined with painted walls and hanging lights, where the smell of food and flowers mixed in the warm morning air. Vendors called out their goods, children laughed, and everywhere there was music. Some came from radios, some from street performers, but all carried a spirit that made the city feel alive. He had never felt anything like it in his life. Europe had its music, elegant and refined, but the energy here was different. It was raw, joyful, and immediate, and even though he did not admit it, he was curious. He wandered into a small square where a mariachi band was performing. 3 men and a woman played violins, guitars, and a small trumpet, dressed in colorful outfits that shimmered in the sunlight. The woman's voice rose over the instruments, full of feeling and pride. The people around clapped and swayed, clearly moved by the performance. He paused, watching from a distance, and his first thought was dismissive. It was loud, cheerful, almost chaotic. The music did not follow the strict rules he valued. But as he observed, he noticed something unexpected. The musician's hands moved with skill, precise and confident. The singer's voice was powerful, controlled, and full of emotion. The crowd reacted with genuine joy, laughing and crying along with the music. It was not the kind of music he played, but it had a life of its own, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of admiration. Despite this faint curiosity, he continued on, telling himself that he was here to perform classical music, not to study folk traditions. He spent the day rehearsing, following every instruction from the festival organizers. They were kind and welcoming, impressed by his skill and dedication. They spoke of including him in a collaboration with local musicians later in the week. He nodded politely, already assuming he would guide them rather than the other way around. In his mind, he was the teacher, the master of technique and refinement, while the local musicians were charming but lacking the depth he valued. That evening, the festival invited performers to a dinner gathering, an opportunity for networking and cultural exchange. The room was warm and lively, filled with musicians from all over the world. People were talking, laughing, and sharing stories about their experiences. The violinist moved politely through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. He felt slightly out of place among the warmth and openness, used as he was to formal receptions and quiet admiration. He preferred the music itself to conversation, believing that skill and talent spoke louder than words. Yet even here he could hear fragments of mariachi music drifting in from nearby streets, and it tugged at the edge of his thoughts. During the dinner, he finally met the young woman who had captivated him earlier in the square. She was smaller than he expected, with bright eyes and an easy smile. She spoke with confidence, yet there was a softness in her tone that suggested deep thought and emotion. When she began to describe her music, her passion was clear. She explained how every note told a story, how the rhythm carried the history of her family and her country, and how each song was a reflection of life itself. He listened, polite but skeptical, convinced that while her words were charming, they could not match the complexity and discipline of classical music. Later that night, he found himself unable to sleep. The city seemed alive with music even from his room. The strumming of guitars, the voices of singers, and the laughter of people echoed in his mind. He thought of the young woman, of her voice, and the intensity with which she played. He had never met a musician who seemed so connected to her instrument and her culture. Her music had a vibrancy he could not easily dismiss, and he realized, with a strange mixture of discomfort and fascination, that he had underestimated it. He tried to focus on the music he was to perform the next day, running through the notes in his mind, but her voice kept returning, haunting and persistent. The following morning he went out early, curious to hear more of the music that had intrigued him. He walked to the square again, and there she was, playing with the same energy and grace he had seen before. This time he stayed longer, watching the way her hands moved, how the other musicians responded to her cues, how the crowd reacted with unrestrained emotion. The precision he valued in classical music was here in a different form, not measured in perfect scales, but in timing, feeling, and connection. The music was alive, and he could feel it deep in his chest. It was something he had never experienced before, and for the first time he questioned his certainty. Perhaps there was more to music than he had allowed himself to see. He began returning to the square regularly, observing quietly from a distance. He watched her interact with other musicians, correcting gently, encouraging, laughing, and singing. He noticed the subtle techniques she used, the way she adjusted her playing to fit the mood of the song, the small variations that brought every performance to life. He saw the joy she inspired in the people around her, the way music connected them, and he began to feel a stirring of respect. It was not admiration for technical perfection alone, but for the life and spirit she infused into every note. He realized that music could be powerful even without following the rules he had been taught, even without the refinement he valued above all. At the hotel, he started to experiment quietly. He took out his violin and tried to mimic the rhythms he had seen in the square. At first, it felt awkward. The timing was different, the style unfamiliar, and he struggled to reproduce the energy and flow. But he persisted. Slowly, he began to feel the pulse of the music, the movement of the bow adapting to the new rhythm. It was not perfect, but it was alive. He felt a new kind of satisfaction, a different joy from the precise execution he was used to. It was raw, emotional, and freeing in a way he had not expected. Over the next few days, he continued to watch and practice in secret, keeping his exploration private. He attended more of the local performances, listening, observing, and sometimes attempting to play along. Each encounter left him more fascinated, more humbled. The young woman noticed his presence occasionally, giving him a nod or a smile, sensing his growing interest without knowing the depth of his internal struggle. He felt both excitement and embarrassment. Excitement for discovering something new and embarrassment for admitting that his previous judgments had been too harsh. One afternoon, a festival organizer approached him with an idea for collaboration. They wanted him to play alongside the young woman in a joint performance, combining European classical music with traditional mariachi. His first reaction was refusal. How could these two worlds fit together? Would it not ruin the elegance of his music? Yet deep down he felt a spark of curiosity. He agreed cautiously, telling himself that he would guide the performance, showing them the proper way to play, while secretly wondering if he might learn something unexpected. As they prepared for the collaboration, he spent hours with the young woman, observing her, asking questions, and slowly discovering the intricacies of mariachi music. He learned about the importance of storytelling in every note, the way emotion was prioritized over strict technical perfection, and the way the music was intertwined with culture and history. He began to understand that his initial dismissal of mariachi as plain was based on ignorance, not reality. The music had depth, skill, and soul, and it demanded attention and respect. By the end of the week, the violinist felt a transformation beginning inside him. The city, the people, and the music had opened his mind. He no longer saw mariachi as simple or plain. He saw it as a living, breathing art form, full of complexity and emotion that required its own kind of mastery. The young woman had not only challenged his assumptions, but had shown him the joy of music beyond the rules he had always followed. He was still a classical musician at heart, but he had discovered a new world, and he was eager to explore it further, knowing that the journey ahead would change him in ways he had never imagined. The day of the joint performance arrived sooner than the violinist expected. The festival had been building toward this event, promoting it as a special union of two worlds of music. Posters around the city carried his picture beside that of the young mariachi singer. People were curious. Could a classical violin blend with the warmth of mariachi? No one knew. The violinist himself felt a strange mix of confidence and uncertainty. He had spent his life mastering music that demanded control, precision, and elegance, but now he was about to share a stage with musicians who played from the heart, not the score. It was a feeling that made him uneasy, yet strangely alive. They met early that morning to rehearse. The young woman greeted him warmly, her smile bright and genuine. Around her, the mariachi group tuned their instruments, laughing and chatting with ease. The atmosphere was relaxed, full of energy, nothing like the silent, formal rehearsals he was used to. He felt slightly out of place at first, his polished violin in hand, surrounded by guitars, trumpets, and voices that filled the room before the music even began. Yet as they started to play, something happened that surprised him. The first notes were unfamiliar to him, but they carried rhythm and soul. He followed hesitantly, his bow moving slower than usual, trying to find where his sound could fit. The young woman noticed at his struggle and encouraged him softly, guiding him with her voice. She sang with passion, and her eyes met his, silently telling him to let go, to stop thinking so much and just feel the music. He hesitated at first, afraid to lose control, afraid of making a mistake. But slowly, the warmth of her voice, the beat of the guitars, and the emotion in the trumpets began to pull him in. As the rehearsal went on, something shifted. He began to relax. His bow moved more freely, the notes less rehearsed, more alive. He started to match their rhythm, blending his violin with their sound. The mariachi musicians smiled, impressed by how he adapted. They showed him how to play certain passages differently, adding little flourishes he had never tried before. At first it felt unnatural, almost chaotic. But soon he realized that behind the energy was structure, a pattern of feeling that guided the music. It was not wild. It was honest. For the first time in years, he stopped worrying about perfection. He simply played. The young woman noticed it immediately. She nodded, her eyes shining with excitement, and her singing grew stronger. The entire group came alive, their music weaving together in a way that filled the room with warmth. When the final note faded, there was silence, followed by laughter and applause from everyone present. The violinist looked around, smiling in disbelief. He had not expected to feel such joy in something so unplanned. The young woman approached him and said gently, "That's how we play here. We don't count every note, we feel them." Her words stayed with him. That night he lay in bed thinking about what had happened. He realized that he had spent most of his life chasing perfection, believing that only flawless execution could make music beautiful. But what he experienced that day was different. It was imperfect, unpredictable, yet more moving than any concert he had played before. It had reached him on a level that went beyond skill. It was about connection, emotion, and truth. The next morning they rehearsed again, this time outdoors on a small stage near the plaza. Crowds gathered to watch, drawn by curiosity and the joyful sound. The violinist could see people clapping, smiling, and dancing. He had played before large audiences in Europe, but this was different. There was no distance between performer and listener here. Everyone was part of the music. The young woman encouraged him to move, to play closer to the people, to feel their energy. He followed her lead, and for once he forgot about technique. He played freely, matching her song with melodies that came straight from his heart. At one point, during a pause in the song, she turned to him and said, "Your violin has a voice. Let it speak." Those simple words struck him deeply. He had always seen his instrument as something to master, to control. But now, it felt like something alive, something that could express emotions words couldn't. He closed his eyes, and when he played again, the sound that came out was softer, warmer, full of feeling. The crowd cheered, and he felt a rush of emotion unlike anything he had known before. The festival night finally came. The venue was packed. People filled every seat, and many stood outside, eager to hear the performance. The stage was decorated with lights and flowers, the air thick with anticipation. Backstage, the violinist felt a flutter of nerves. He looked at his violin, polished and shining, and took a deep breath. The young woman noticed his unease and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't think," she whispered. "Just play." When the lights dimmed and the music began, the sound was electric. The mariachi band started with a lively rhythm, the trumpets bright and bold. The violinist joined in, his sound weaving through theirs, soft and elegant at first, then growing stronger. The young woman began to sing, her voice powerful and full of soul. Together, their music filled the air, blending two worlds into one. The audience was mesmerized. As they played, he felt something inside him change. The lines between classical and folk blurred. The music was not about categories or traditions anymore, it was about emotion. Every note, every breath, every smile between the musicians felt real. The violinist could feel the energy of the crowd feeding into their performance. The people clapped along, sang along, and even cried during the slower, more emotional parts. He had never experienced anything like it. In Europe, audiences listened quietly, reserved and polite. Here the crowd lived the music with them. Halfway through the performance, something unexpected happened. The young woman signaled for him to take a solo, one that wasn't written down or rehearsed. His mind froze for a moment. He was used to reading notes, following sheets, staying within structure. But now there was no paper, no guidance, just the rhythm and the moment. She smiled at him encouragingly, her eyes saying, "Go ahead." He lifted his violin and began to play. At first, the notes were hesitant, searching for direction. But then something took over. The crowd faded, the lights disappeared, and he played purely by instinct. The melody that came out was new yet familiar, shaped by both his training and his newfound freedom. The mariachi band followed his lead, supporting him, adding harmony and rhythm. The young woman joined in softly, her voice rising with his violin, creating a duet that made the audience fall silent. Every note carried emotion, honesty, and beauty. When the final note ended, there was a moment of stillness as if no one dared to breathe. Then the crowd erupted in applause, cheers, and whistles. People stood up, clapping and shouting with joy. The violinist lowered his bow slowly, his heart pounding, his eyes glistening with emotion. He had never felt so alive, so connected. The young woman turned to him and smiled, her face glowing under the lights. He smiled back, speechless. After the performance, people gathered around, congratulating them, taking pictures, asking for autographs. The festival organizers were overjoyed, calling it a historic moment of cultural unity. But for the violinist, it was something much deeper. It was not about fame or success, it was about transformation. He had come to Mexico believing he knew everything about music. Now he realized he had only known a part of it. The rest lived here in the laughter, the emotion, and the humanity of the people who played from their hearts. That night, as he walked back to his hotel, the city seemed different. The streets glowed with life, and everywhere he turned he could hear music. But now he listened differently. He no longer heard noise. He heard stories. Each song carried a piece of someone's soul. He understood, finally, that music was not about complexity or prestige. It was about feeling, about sharing something real with others. It was about connection. In his room, he placed his violin on the table and sat quietly for a long time. He thought about his journey, about the walls he had built between himself and other forms of art. He realized that real music didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be true, and that truth could come from anywhere, from a grand concert hall in Europe or a small plaza in Mexico. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about practice or perfection. He was thinking about people, about emotion, about life. The music had changed him, and he knew he would never play the same way again. The next morning, he returned to the square. The young woman and her band were already there, performing for a small crowd. When she saw him, she waved him over. Without a word, he joined in, his violin blending effortlessly with their instruments. There were no rehearsals, no scores, just music, simple and real. And as he played, surrounded by laughter and sunlight, he felt completely at home. The days that followed the performance were filled with an energy that the violinist had never felt before. Wherever he went, people recognized him from the festival. Some stopped to thank him for bringing something new to their city, while others simply smiled and waved. But what touched him the most was not the attention, it was the warmth. The people of Mexico welcomed him, as if he had been one of them all along. Their kindness felt genuine, and their appreciation for music boundless. He spent more time with the young woman and her mariachi group, not as a guest, but as a friend. They invited him to join their small performances around the city. Some took place in plazas under the open sky, others at weddings or family gatherings. Each event was different, but every one of them was filled with laughter, dancing, and a deep sense of community. It amazed him how music connected everyone so naturally. There were no rehearsals, no strict programs, just feelings. The musicians looked at one another, exchanged smiles, and somehow everything flowed. One evening, after a long day of playing, the group sat together outside a cafe. The air was cool and the sky above was painted in orange and purple shades. They talked about life, family, and dreams. The violinist listened more than he spoke. He realized how much he had missed by always focusing on himself, his career, his perfection, his achievements. These people found happiness in the simplest moments, sharing stories, singing together, or helping a neighbor. Their lives were not driven by competition, but by connection. It humbled him. He began to see his own past differently. He thought of all the times he had refused to collaborate with other musicians because he thought their music was beneath him. He remembered how he had judged entire cultures without understanding their roots. The more he reflected, the more he felt a quiet sadness. But there was also gratitude, because now he had the chance to change. The young woman's friendship and patience. He had shown him a new way to see the world, through sound, through feeling, through people. One day, the young woman invited him to her hometown, a small village outside the city, where her family still lived. She wanted him to experience where her music came from. They traveled together early in the morning, the road winding through green hills and small farms. He watched through the window as the scenery changed from crowded streets to open fields. Children waved as their car passed by. and old men sat outside shops playing guitars softly. It was a simple place, but beautiful in its peace. When they arrived, her family welcomed him with open arms. Her mother cooked a traditional meal, and her father, who was also a musician, insisted on playing a song for their guest. The violinist felt overwhelmed by their warmth. After lunch, they all gathered in the courtyard where musicians from the village came together. Guitars, violins, trumpets, every instrument came alive. The music filled the air, full of love and history. The young woman sang, her voice echoing through the open space, carrying stories of her ancestors, of love and loss, of hope and pride. He closed his eyes and listened. Every note carried something he could feel but not fully explain. It wasn't about perfection, it was about truth. These songs had been passed down through generations, keeping memories alive. He realized that what he had once called plain was in fact rich and deep. This music wasn't just about entertainment. It was about identity. It reminded people who they were and where they came from. It made them feel alive. When it was his turn to play, he hesitated for a moment. What could his violin say in front of such honest music? The young woman nodded, encouraging him softly. He lifted his violin and began to play, not a piece from a famous composer, but something simple, something from his heart. He played what he felt at that moment: gratitude, respect, and wonder. His music intertwined with theirs, and for a brief time, it didn't matter where he was from or what training he had received. The village and his violin spoke the same language, the language of emotion. After the performance, the villagers cheered and clapped. One of the older men approached him and said with a smile, "Now you understand our music." The violinist nodded, his eyes shining. He felt something shift inside him, something he knew would never go back to how it was. Later that night, he walked outside the house, looking at the stars. The young woman joined him quietly. They stood side by side, listening to the distant sound of a guitar being played somewhere in the village. After a while, she said, "When I first saw you perform at the festival, I thought you were amazing. But I also felt sad for you." He looked at her, surprised. "Sad?" he asked softly. She nodded. "You played beautifully, but it felt like you were alone in your music. It was perfect, but it didn't breathe. Music isn't meant to be alone. It's meant to be shared." Her words went straight to his heart. He realized she was right. All his life, he had played for applause, for recognition, for validation. But here he played for connection. For once, his music was not about him. It was about everyone around him. He had found what he didn't know he was missing. The next morning, the village held a small celebration before they left. The young woman's family insisted he take a traditional handmade violin strap as a gift, a symbol of friendship and unity. He accepted it with tears in his eyes, promising to treasure it forever. As they drove back to the city, he looked out the window, lost in thought. He had come to Mexico as a man of pride and certainty. Now he was leaving that pride behind, replaced by humility and curiosity. Back in the city, the festival organizers asked if he would like to perform one final time before returning to Europe. This time he didn't hesitate. But he had a condition. He wanted to share the stage with the Mariachi group. The organizers were thrilled, and soon preparations began for another unforgettable night. During rehearsals, he no longer acted like the leader or the teacher. Instead, he listened. He laughed with the musicians, learned their rhythms, and shared ideas. He told them stories of his home, and they told him theirs. They even wrote a new piece together, one that combined classical violin with mariachi melody. It was unlike anything he had ever played before, yet it felt right. It felt real. The night of the final concert came, and the hall was filled again, this time with an even larger crowd. People from all backgrounds came to see this unique collaboration. The young woman and her group stood beside him, dressed in their colorful outfits. The lights dimmed, and the room fell silent. The first note came from his violin, soft, graceful, familiar. Then, the mariachi joined in, their guitars and trumpets blending seamlessly with his melody. The sound was breathtaking. It was elegant yet earthy, structured yet free. It carried both worlds, the discipline of classical music and the soul of mariachi. The audience was silent at first, captivated. Then as the music grew, people began to clap in rhythm, unable to stay still. The energy in the hall was electric. The violinist looked around at the smiling faces, the joyful musicians, and the glowing lights, and he felt tears form in his eyes. He realized he had finally understood what music truly was. It was not about perfection or prestige. It was about emotion, unity, and love. When the last note faded, the audience erupted in applause. People stood cheering and shouting his name alongside the mariachi bands. He bowed deeply, not as a performer above others, but as one of them. The young woman hugged him tightly, whispering, "You did it." He smiled, unable to find the right words. The performance was more than just music. It was a bridge between worlds, a moment of understanding that would stay with him forever. That night, after everyone had gone, he stayed on the stage for a while, looking at the empty seats. The lights were dim and the echo of the performance still hung in the air. He thought about how far he had come, from a man who once dismissed mariachi as plain to someone who now felt honored to play it. His journey had changed him completely. He had learned that greatness in music doesn't come from how many notes you can play perfectly, but from how deeply you can touch a heart. Before leaving Mexico, he met once more with the young woman. They shared a quiet meal and spoke about their dreams. She told him she planned to travel the world, sharing the beauty of her culture with others. He promised to do the same, to tell people about what he had learned, to play their music with the respect it deserved. As they said goodbye, he felt a deep sense of peace. Their paths might go in different directions, but the connection they built through music would never fade. As his plane took off, he looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there, he could almost hear the sound of a trumpet, a guitar, and a voice singing with joy. He smiled. The man who had once looked down on that sound now carried it in his heart forever. Months passed since the Italian violinist returned to Europe. His life had changed in many quiet but powerful ways. The grand halls he used to play in still welcomed him, but the way he felt on stage was different now. The applause that once fed his ego now reminded him of something deeper. The smiles he saw in Mexico, the sound of laughter echoing between the notes of a mariachi song, and the warmth of people who played not for fame, but for joy. When he played now, he didn't just perform, he shared. His audiences began to feel that difference too. Critics said his music had gained a new soul, a tenderness that had never been there before. The world noticed, but he didn't seek their approval anymore. His heart belonged to something far more genuine than any award could offer. In his apartment in Rome, he kept a small corner decorated with memories from his time in Mexico. A handmade violin strap, a photograph of the village celebration, and a small clay figure of a mariachi musician. Every morning before practice, he looked at them. They reminded him that music was not only an art, it was a connection. It lived in the hands of people, in their stories and in their laughter. One afternoon, as he prepared for a major performance, he received an unexpected letter. It was written in Spanish, and when he opened it, he instantly recognized the handwriting. It was from the young woman. She wrote that her mariachi group had been invited to perform in Spain for a cultural exchange event. She wondered if he might attend, maybe even join them for a song. His heart leapt with happiness. Without hesitation, he wrote back, saying he wouldn't miss it for the world. A few weeks later, he flew to Madrid. The moment he landed, he felt a familiar excitement, that same spark he had felt before the festival in Mexico. The city was alive with color and rhythm. Musicians from around the world had gathered for the event. When he arrived at the venue, he saw her waiting near the stage, wearing her bright mariachi outfit and that same confident smile. Time seemed to pause for a moment. They greeted each other warmly, both laughing as if no time had passed at all. She introduced him to the other musicians, who were thrilled to see him again. They shared stories of the old days, of the performances in the village and of the unforgettable night when they played together in Mexico City. He felt at home among them. No barriers, no titles, no sense of hierarchy. Just friends brought together by the love of sound. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the festival began. Musicians from different cultures performed their traditional pieces, each one sharing something unique about their homeland. When it was time for the mariachi group to perform, the crowd cheered with excitement. The violinist stood at the side, watching as they began to play. Their music filled the air, joyful and bold. The audience clapped along, enchanted by the rhythms. Halfway through the performance, the young woman turned toward him and nodded. The crowd watched as he stepped on stage with his violin. The room grew quiet for a moment, curiosity and anticipation mixing in the air. He smiled at her, lifted his bow, and began to play. The first notes were soft, carrying the elegance of classical style. Then gradually he wove his melody into theirs, a graceful dance between European tradition and Mexican soul. The result was breathtaking. The violins sang, the guitars answered, and the trumpets lifted the melody to the heavens. It was as if two worlds spoke in harmony, understanding each other without words. The crowd erupted in cheers, and some even had tears in their eyes. The violinist felt that same overwhelming joy he had felt months ago in Mexico. The feeling of belonging, of unity, of pure expression. After the performance, reporters surrounded him, asking what inspired such an unexpected collaboration. He smiled and simply said, "I didn't teach them. They taught me. I came to Mexico thinking I knew music. I left realizing I knew only notes. They showed me the meaning behind them." His honesty touched everyone who heard him. The story spread, and soon people around the world were talking about the Italian violinist who found his soul in mariachi. In the weeks that followed, he and the young woman stayed in Spain, performing at several more events together. Everywhere they went, the audience was enchanted by the combination of their sounds. They didn't need to explain it, and the music spoke for itself. It carried the message that art has no borders, that respect and curiosity can unite cultures more powerfully than anything else. Late one night, after a small concert in a quiet Spanish town, they sat together outside, the night air cool and calm. The young woman plucked the strings of her guitar softly while he leaned back, looking up at the stars. "You know," she said, smiling gently, "when we first met, I thought you'd never understand us." He laughed. "I thought the same," he replied. "But now I realize I was the one who didn't understand music." She looked at him with a warm expression. "You understand it now? You play with your heart." He nodded slowly, thinking about all the lessons life had taught him in such unexpected ways. "And you," he said softly. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." She didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. In the following months, their collaboration turned into something bigger than either of them expected. Music schools began inviting them to talk about cultural exchange and the importance of learning from others. The violinist shared his journey openly, how pride had blinded him and how humility had opened his ears. Students listened with admiration. They weren't hearing a lecture. They were hearing a man's transformation. One day, while preparing for a concert in Rome, the violinist found himself standing in front of an old theater. It was the same place where he had once turned down an opportunity to collaborate with a folk musician, dismissing it as too simple. He remembered his arrogance and felt a wave of emotion. This time he entered that theater not as a judge but as a learner. He was there to perform with local street musicians, people whose songs told stories of everyday life. When the crowd applauded that night, it wasn't just for the music. It was for the unity it represented. Backstage, he sat quietly, holding his violin strap, the one given to him in the village. It had faded slightly, but its meaning had grown stronger. He realized that the young woman's friendship had given him something no master or critic ever could: perspective. Music was not about climbing higher. It was about reaching deeper. One evening, he received another letter from her. This time, she invited him to visit her again. Her group had grown, and they were planning a new project blending traditional mariachi with influences from around the world. She wanted him to be part of it. His heart swelled with emotion as he read her words. He packed his violin, the strap, and boarded a plane once again. When he arrived in Mexico, everything felt both familiar and new. The streets were lively, filled with color and song. When he saw her waiting at the airport, their reunion was full of warmth. Together, they went back to the village where everything had started. The same musicians were there, a little older, but with the same light in their eyes. The air was filled with laughter, the smell of food and the sound of music echoing in every corner. That night, under a canopy of stars, they performed together once more. But this time, something was different. The stage wasn't grand, and there were no cameras or critics, just villagers, families, and children sitting close, clapping and singing along. It was simple, but it was real. The music flowed naturally, as if it belonged to the night itself. The violinist played with all his heart, his sound blending perfectly with the mariachi. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was home. As the last song ended, the young woman looked at him and smiled. "You've become one of us," she said quietly. He laughed softly, his eyes glistening. "No," he replied. "I've finally become myself." The crowd cheered, and as he looked around, he saw faces full of happiness, connection, and pride. He realized that this simple moment under the stars, was the greatest concert of his life. Years later, when people spoke about him, they didn't just call him the Italian violinist anymore. They called him the man who united worlds through music, and whenever he played, whether in a grand concert hall or a small town square, somewhere in his melody there was always a trace of mariachi, the sound that once humbled him and forever changed his soul. And so his story lived on, not as one of fame or glory, but as one of growth, humility, and friendship. Because in the end, the greatest music isn't the one that shows perfection, it's the one that shows the heart.